Welcome back. We are at what we consider the final steps of the HIA process, monitoring and evaluation. If you look at the minimum elements, these two areas tend to be talked about together, but some HIA guidelines and other ones you might see have the processes separated. I like to separate them, and I'll talk about them separately today, but they're going to just sort of be thought of as sort of a one module for the purposes of instruction. So HIA monitoring and evaluation refers to when the HIA team and stakeholders evaluate the HIA according to accepted standards of practice. This is also the time to propose a plan for monitoring and measuring the HIA's impact on decision making and the effects of the implemented decision on health. As I mentioned, this is widely described as the quote-unquote final stage of the HIA. And what we're talking about in monitoring and evaluation is the evaluation part, which relates to thinking of process, impact, and outcome evaluation, and we'll cover each of those in a moment, and how they relate to the HIA process. And monitoring. And monitoring is thinking about when we implement the HIA's recommendations, what's happening, tracking the effects of the proposed action on health determinants and health outcomes as it's implemented. If you recall earlier when we did the assessment step, I talked about these indicators that we're using for our impact assessment. This is when you're tracking those indicators. So we're going back to those and we're following those over time. As a researcher, I will say monitoring and evaluation is really challenging because it's not always clear-cut, particularly for HIA. Let me ask you, when does an HIA end? You know, when is it over? Is it over once we disseminate the report? Is it over once the decision is made? It's really not clear for the field, and people sort of define that endpoint differently. The other question I think is hard for people to really reconcile is, well, who should evaluate? There are individuals who are HIA practitioners who believe that if I conduct an HIA, I should not be the person evaluating my HIA. There are perspectives that we need an independent body that's evaluating all HIAs and who can objectively answer the questions around monitoring and evaluation. I think it's okay if I evaluate my own HIA, again, tying and emphasizing the importance of transparency with how I did that, but some people might disagree with that. You have to figure out where you fall on that line. But a lot of times people don't have resources to have an external evaluation, and right now there is no centralized body in the US that's doing that or taking on that role. So let's talk about monitoring for a little bit and then we'll talk about evaluation. So monitoring can be used to assure accountability in the implementation of the HIA's recommendations. This is really the time where we think about who's going to be responsible for that project proponent or sort of that authorizing, funding, or implementing public agency. Monitoring and comprehensive and long-term monitoring is not the responsibility of, and usually not within the capacity of, the HIA team. The HIA team should, however, propose that monitoring plan. But if we go back to what I mentioned earlier, for example, in a transportation decision, the HIA team might identify the health impacts, make recommendations that can be implemented, and it's really up to the transportation unit or agency to monitor over time how things are changing. The HIA team, though, can be very helpful by proposing a plan for how they would do that. A monitoring plan might include short and long-term goals. It might include those indicators I mentioned earlier that the agency could track over time. It also might include thresholds or triggers at which that monitoring agency might need to review and adapt the decision's implementation in order to protect health. So for example, you might have a monitoring plan that says, well, when this happens, you need to do this. And we see that sometimes. A monitoring plan might include a list of resources that are needed to actually complete the monitoring and a mechanism to report findings to decision makers and stakeholders. I will say that not every HIA includes a monitoring plan. This is one of those things that I think sort of falls by the wayside, particularly when you're operating on a grant-funded HIA and you're running out of time. But when a monitoring plan is included, we found it's very helpful for the agency that's implementing the recommendations. So let's turn our attention to HIA evaluation. As I mentioned earlier, there are 3 components to HIA evaluation, and let's begin with process. So process evaluation for an HIA considers whether the HIA was carried out according to established standards and the original assessment plan. I think process evaluation is really important. It provides valuable insight on how the HIA was designed and carried out, and can also really help to think through how the HIA process can be improved, particularly if you're at an agency that is doing multiple HIAs. Process evaluation typically includes observing or documenting aspects of the HIA process, talking with stakeholders, looking at how the HIA was disseminated, conducting focus groups, interviews, surveys, etc. I have conducted HIA evaluations, particularly of process evaluations, and have found this again to be a great way to really get a handle on the field, to understand how HIAs can be conducted in a way that is most impactful, what are those facilitators and barriers. And we see most evaluations really are centered on those process measures. The second type of evaluation relevant to HIA that we think about is impact evaluation. And when we think about HIA and an impact evaluation, we're trying to understand the impact of the HIA itself on the decision-making process. So this sometimes is a little confusing for people who think about impacts and impacts on health. In this context, HIA evaluation for impact evaluation is how did the HIA impact the decision-making process, and whether and to what degree were the recommendations adopted and implemented. There are studies that have documented indirect impacts, which they consider new collaborations, increased awareness of health, etc. But what I want to emphasize here is that the impact evaluation is about the HIA and how did it impact the decision. During this aspect, we try to measure perspectives on stakeholders, try to look and see if those recommendations were actually adopted and implemented. Also look to see, what were the objectives met in terms of that HIA and what we've learned in terms of how people were impacted. I think what's really important about this particular aspect of HIA evaluation is that sometimes we can actually see those changes. And so, for example, if we have an HIA that says you have to or make a recommendation to put in a new sidewalk, for example, around a built environment intervention, we can actually go out and see if that sidewalk is there. Right? And so that makes it a little bit easier. I'm going to talk about outcome evaluation in a second, which is a bit harder for HIAs. But again, we're talking about the HIA itself on the decision-making process and whether and to what degree the recommendations were adopted and implemented. Sadly, this is a part of the HIA evaluation step that is not done very often. And when you ask people why not, they say, well, the grant ended, or sometimes the decision is made, but it just takes really a long time to implement changes. So think about changes to the built environment. There's oftentimes a permit process and a bidding process, and it takes 2 or 3 years before something that was approved and that was recommended actually comes to fruition. And by that time, the HIA team has moved on to the next HIA. The final aspect of HIA evaluation is outcome evaluation. And this is where we're measuring changes in health status or indicators resulting from implementation of the proposal. So if we think about HIAs and we're looking at a proposed policy, project, or plan, we're measuring how did health change, how did health disparities change, how did those indicators change. And this step is really used, or this aspect of the HIA step is really used to assess whether by implementing the proposed recommendations, health change or health determinants change. I will say this type of evaluation is rarely done. It's complex, it's difficult, and people think about all of the challenges around things like confounding and being able to say that this particular proposal led to these outcomes is really hard. But we do know that there are efforts that going on nationally to sort of retrospectively and prospectively try to document these impacts, because this part of the process is what we hear policymakers wanting to know more about. They want to know, well, how did health change after doing this HIA? So I'm hopeful that we'll get some information in the future to help really document these impacts. HIAs, in addition to having a monitoring plan, should have an evaluation plan where it defines who's going to do the evaluation, what's the scope, purpose, objectives, and research questions, what are the resources, what's the timeline, what are the methods, and how to engage stakeholders in the evaluation itself. I want to share with you a little bit about what we've learned from evaluation research of HIAs in the US. To date, there have been sort of 4 big evaluations that have been done. I'll start with the bottom left, and that was one that I led that came out of Johns Hopkins University, looking at all HIAs completed up through 2012 and really focuses on process measures. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation had an evaluation done of their grantees through the Health Impact Project. There was an evaluation done of HIAs in Australia and New Zealand. And the CDC did their own evaluation of some trainings that they had conducted. So if we think about those 4, I'm going to highlight some lessons learned. Andy Dannenberg published a paper in 2016 that summarized these 4 evaluations. And here's some just highlights of what he found. First is that there are clear factors that influence the effectiveness of HIA. So we know there are things we can do to make the HIA more effective in terms of decision making. And when we think about what those effects are, we saw that, or Andy Dannenberg saw that there are direct effects, which means that the decision target was changed. But more often, there were these indirect effects that were documented. So for example, increased recognition of social determinants of health. There were examples of where HIAs created new relationships between the decision maker and their constituents. Or other examples where the HIA gave community members a stronger voice in the decisions that affected them. Remember, we talked about this during the equity module. So these indirect effects are really important and have been documented, I would say even more so than those direct effects. Other things that this review showed that are really important for HIAs are the role of the decision maker. We know that when a decision maker is engaged in the HIA process, those recommendations that come out of the HIA are more likely to be implemented and accepted, and the findings are most likely to sort of be supported. We know that creating actionable recommendations are really important again. And for HIAs that did this, they were more likely to actually lead to some change in the decision or to recommendations being implemented. We talked about this during the recommendations step of the HIA process, and these results just highlight and emphasize the importance of having actionable recommendations, having recommendations that the decision maker can just take and implement. And finally, what this review showed was the importance of timing. I've said it several times now throughout these modules. HIAs are about a proposed decision. Think back to that example we did during the screening module. Sometimes there's not enough time to do the HIA. But the worst is having an HIA that's finished after the decision is made. That's really not useful at all. So think through timing, and if the HIA is completed in enough time to share with the decision makers before the decision is made, we know that it's a really good chance that they're going to pay attention to those recommendations, especially if they were engaged throughout the process. So I'm going to end this module by highlighting factors that may increase HIA success or some challenges to successful HIAs. And this is from, these factors are from a paper published based on the RWJF evaluation that I showed on a couple slides ago. So these list of factors were identified from a number of interviews and document reviews of completed HIAs, and they found that one of the important things for HIA success, and success being identified as having a direct impact or an indirect impact, was care in choosing a project or policy to be examined. I said earlier in the screening module how important it is to decide whether or not you should do an HIA, and that includes thinking about the topic. So that's one of the things we know, that having a really good, clear project or policy is really important. Having the appropriate team to conduct the HIA is also important. If you decide that your HIA should include qualitative data collection, for example, having somebody in your team who's experienced in those methods is really important to help with the credibility of those findings on the back end. Engaging stakeholders and decision makers throughout the process is also something that was shown to help facilitate success of HIAs, and I've said this a few times, and I will say it again in the final module I cover on stakeholder engagement. Engaging stakeholders is critical. Crafting clear and actionable recommendations that are timely. Again, timing is so important for HIAs. We want to have the HIA complete in order to inform the decision that is currently under consideration. And having those recommendations that can be implemented, that are clearly written, and that are actionable are really important as well. And finally, to relate to the module we just completed on reporting, having multiple dissemination methods is also really clear, and really a key factor. And what we mean by that is using the ways that are going to get to the various people who need to know about the HIA. And I mentioned this before, that could include social media for one particular group. It could include briefings, community meetings, whatever it is. Know the dissemination methods that are going to make most sense for the individuals who need to know about your HIA and know what you found. And some challenges that they documented to successful HIAs are here. One was underestimating the level of effort required. And I think this is a challenge for all HIA practitioners, where you might say this is going to take X number of hours or X% of effort, and it ends up being a lot more than that. And you have to think about things like in-kind support. But I think things just take longer than we ever think. And sometimes things take even longer when you have real decisions that are being made and there are delays and things might happen. I worked on an HIA once that there were many amendments to the bill, and it actually it lasted over a number of legislative sessions before the HIA bill was finally actually completed, and we were able to see if our recommendations were part of that process. A second challenge that was documented were some political changes occurring during the conduct of the HIA. There was an HIA that was done on decisions coming out of a legislative body, and while the HIA was being conducted, elections happened and the whole chambers completely turned over from one political party to another. So you can imagine how challenging that was in the middle of the HIA, where the team was engaging stakeholders and proceeding down a path around one set of policies, and then in the middle of the HIA process, those policies completely changed. And in order to be relevant, the team wanted to change with it and not continue and completing the HIA on things that were no longer going to be even considered. Another challenge is having access to relevant local data, and I talked about this during the assessment step. If we're doing an HIA in Baltimore, for example, we want to have data that are from Baltimore so we can highlight those health effects. And sometimes, though, the data are not there. So two strategies I've done is either look at data from other places in Baltimore that are, from Maryland that are similar, so maybe within the county or some other state level data, or find a city that is comparable that we feel like we can generalize their findings to. It's just hard sometimes to get access to the data. We have seen memorandums of agreement set up for data sharing so that the health department can provide data to other sectors who are doing the HIA. So I think it's important to think through these things during the scoping step, going back to an earlier module, so that way we don't have these challenges when it's time to actually do the assessment. We also know that there are some challenges with engaging stakeholders, particularly individuals who might be disproportionately impacted by a decision. And so thinking through the best way to engage stakeholders is really important, and we'll come back to that in the final module. And finally, following up on recommendations, one of the challenges that came out of this research was that once recommendations were made, the HIA team sort of completed their work, and there really wasn't much follow-up on those recommendations just because the HIA grant ended. And so when you think about that, it's hard to really understand if the recommendations were the right ones, were they implemented, particularly if nobody's really evaluating or monitoring what happens on the back end. So that's the end of this module on monitoring and evaluation. My goal was just to introduce you to the concepts and to help you think through monitoring and evaluation. I know I raised a number of questions for you to think about in your own practice if you were going to complete an HIA. But I want to say that there are a lot of resources out there. They're on the resource list I provided, and I'm also here as somebody who does work in this area to help answer questions and think through this when the time comes, or if the time comes that you're going to complete an HIA yourself. So thank you for your time, and we will turn to the last module, which is around stakeholder engagement. Thank you.